You are told that your suffering is your fault, that your poverty is a consequence of your laziness, your exhaustion a product of poor discipline, your insecurity the price of your freedom. From childhood you are conditioned to believe that the world you inherit is natural, eternal, and unchangeable. But I tell you this, nothing about your struggle is personal. Everything you endure is historical. You suffer not because you have failed, but because a system has succeeded. For centuries the ruling class has refined one art above all others, the art of misdirection. They ensure that the exploited blame themselves rather than the conditions imposed upon them. You wake before dawn, you labor until your body aches, you give your energy, your creativity, your very life to engines of profit, yet you are taught to feel gratitude for wages that barely sustain you. This inversion of reality is not an accident, but a mechanism of control described throughout history, a phenomenon that every epoch of class domination reproduces in new forms. The worker's alienation, first from the product of labor, then from the process, then from others, and finally from oneself, is not a psychological accident. It is a structural necessity of capitalism. The system thrives only when you are separated from the wealth you create, from the decisions that shape your life, and from the collective power that could transform society. The capitalist proclaims liberty, yet commands your obedience, speaks of equality, yet sits upon mountains of accumulated labor that is not his own, praises competition, yet consolidates power into the hands of fewer and fewer masters of capital. And every crisis, every recession, every period of turmoil reveals the truth Marx long exposed. Capitalism is not governed by morality but by profit, not by human needs but by accumulation. Look around you. See the contradictions sharpen. Productivity climbs to heights unimaginable in previous centuries, yet wages stagnate. The means of production advance with astonishing speed, yet the majority live in perpetual insecurity. Wealth piles up in the pockets of the few, while the many struggle to survive. This is not misfortune. This is the logic of a system built upon exploitation. The surplus you generate, the value you create beyond what is returned to you, becomes the foundation of capital's power, the fuel of its expansion, the lifeblood of the ruling class. But there is a truth even more powerful than exploitation. The working class is the real engine of history. As Marx wrote, the oppressed have shaped every transformation of society, not the rulers who claimed credit for them. Monarchies crumbled not by royal will but by mass awakening. Feudalism collapsed not through generosity but through collective struggle. And capitalism, though mighty, is no exception. Its contradictions grow. Its inequalities deepen, its promises ring hollow to millions, who now see that their suffering is not individual failure but systemic design. Your struggle, then, is not an isolated wound but the mark of a class bound together by a shared condition. You are part of a vast and historical force, the global working class whose numbers, talents, and labor sustain every structure of the modern world. Without you no factory runs, no office functions, no technology is produced, no society moves. The ruling class depends entirely on your labor, yet strives endlessly to convince you of your weakness. But history tells a different story. When workers become conscious of their power, no structure of domination can withstand them. This is why unity is feared. This is why division is cultivated. This is why ethnic, national, and cultural differences are weaponized to fragment the very class that holds the power to transform society. The ruling class has always known that a disorganized working class is manageable, but a conscious, united working class is unstoppable. Every effort is made to convince you that you stand alone, that your neighbor is your competitor, that your co-worker is your rival, that your fate depends solely on individual effort rather than collective struggle. But you are not alone. You are never alone. You belong to a class whose struggle spans centuries, whose aspirations echo across revolution, whose victories, when achieved, reshape the very foundations of society. And so I say to you, the first act of liberation is understanding. To see your suffering not as personal failure, but as a symptom of structural exploitation. To recognize that the power of the ruling class rests upon the labor of the many. To understand that freedom under capitalism remains incomplete so long as workers lack control over the condition of their existence. To grasp that true emancipation is collective, never individual. The second act is organization. History teaches us that systems do not dissolve through hope alone. They are transformed when those who sustain them unite, articulate their demands, and build institutions capable of challenging entrenched power. Every movement that has altered the course of history began with ordinary people discovering their extraordinary power when joined together. Your struggle is historical. Your voice is part of a larger chorus, and your fight is inseparable from the millions who share your condition. When you rise with them. When they awaken with you. The future is not written by those who sit atop structures of privilege. It is written by those who refuse to accept that injustice is inevitable. You are part of something bigger, the long, ongoing struggle of humanity to liberate itself from domination, inequality, and exploitation. And when you understand this, when you stand with others who understand it, when you transform consciousness into organization and organization into action, then the world that once seemed immovable becomes open to change. The chains that bind you are historical. So too is the power that can break them. Your suffering is not individual, it is the result of historical class exploitation. A condition produced not by your personal shortcomings but by the structure of an economic system that predates you and extends far beyond your individual life. From the moment you enter the world, you inherit a position within a hierarchy you did not choose, a system that assigns value to human beings according to their usefulness in producing profit rather than their inherent dignity. What appears as a personal struggle, a failure to keep up with rising costs, an inability to secure stable work, a constant fight to balance survival with the demands placed upon you is actually the lived expression of a social order shaped through centuries of unequal ownership, concentrated power, and relentless extraction of labor. Your exhaustion is not a private burden but a structural consequence of being situated within a mode of production that measures worth by output, while denying the worker ownership of that output. Capitalism's greatest triumph is convincing individuals that their hardships arise from personal mistakes, not from systemic design. When you cannot afford medical care, you are told to budget better. When wages stagnate while productivity rises, you are told to work smarter. When rent consumes half your income, you are told to try harder, to compete more fiercely, to climb a ladder that only narrows as you ascend. This narrative masks the underlying truth that your labor produces far more value than you receive, and the gap between what you create and what you are paid is the foundation of capital accumulation. The wealth of the ruling class is not the product of their brilliance, discipline, or innovation. It is the crystallized labor of millions whose names history forgets, but whose work sustains every institution that claims authority. Your life is shaped by forces that began long before you. When feudalism gave way to capitalism, land once held collectively was enclosed, workers were stripped of independent means of survival, and entire populations were thrust into wage labor as their only option. This violent historical shift created the conditions you now inhabit: dependence on a wage for survival, competition among workers for limited positions, and the perpetual insecurity that accompanies a market-driven existence. These dynamics persist not because of personal failure, but because they are fundamental to how the system reproduces itself across generations. Even your sense of identity is shaped by this structure. You are taught to see yourself as isolated, as an individual responsible for your destiny regardless of the forces acting upon you. Yet the pressures you face, the rising cost of living, the intensification of work, the erosion of social safety nets, the constant need to prove your worth to employers are experienced by millions in nearly identical forms. This repetition across lives and regions reveals not coincidence but design. It exposes the systemic nature of suffering that capitalism renders invisible by framing each hardship as a private matter rather than a manifestation of class relations. The history of exploitation is not confined to factories or fields. It reaches into homes, schools, hospitals, and digital spaces, shaping every sphere of existence. When you struggle to rest because your mind is consumed by economic anxiety, when you suppress your creativity because survival demands conformity, when you sacrifice relationships because work devours your time, You experience the extension of exploitation beyond the workplace into the core of your being. Capitalism does not merely take your labor, it takes your time, your energy, your potential, and often your hope. This extraction of life itself is a continuation of historical patterns that transform human beings into instruments of profit rather than subjects of their own destiny. Understanding that your suffering is historical is the first step toward reclaiming the power obscured by narratives of individual responsibility. It reveals that the challenges you face are not signs of personal inadequacy, but evidence of a system functioning exactly as designed, a system that thrives on inequality, depends on division, and perpetuates insecurity to maintain control. When you recognize that your struggle is shared, that it mirrors the experiences of countless others across time and geography, you begin to see yourself not as an isolated victim of misfortune, but as part of a class whose collective oppression has always been the engine driving social transformation. Capitalism survives by alienating workers from their labor, power, and each other, creating a social order in which human beings are separated from the very essence of what makes them human. Alienation is not an accidental byproduct of the system, but its lifeblood, the mechanism through which exploitation becomes sustainable and resistance becomes fragmented. When a worker enters the workplace, they enter not as a creator or a thinker, but as a commodity whose value is measured by the hours they can sell. Their labor becomes something external, something owned, shaped, and controlled by another. What they produce does not belong to them, does not reflect their desires, does not express their creativity, and often does not even remain in sight long enough for them to recognize the connection between their effort and the final outcome. Labor becomes a means of survival, rather than an activity that fulfills or empowers. And this reduction of human labor to a market transaction is the foundation of alienation. Workers are alienated from the products they create because those products are immediately appropriated by capital. They pour their time, strength, and skill into creating value that will never return to them. The commodity becomes the property of the capitalist, who sells it for profit while the worker receives only a fraction of the value they produced. This separation is not just economic, it is psychological. The worker sees the world filled with their creations, buildings constructed, goods manufactured, systems maintained, yet they experience no control over them. Their own labor confronts them as something foreign, as a power belonging to others who use it to expand their dominance. This is the first fracture in the human experience under capitalism. Alienation also seizes control of the labor process itself. The worker does not decide how to work, at what pace, for what purpose, or with what methods. Their own activity becomes dictated by the rhythm of machines, the orders of managers, the demands of productivity quotas, and the relentless pressure to produce more in less time. Work becomes repetitive, monotonous, and devoid of personal meaning. Instead of being an expression of human potential, labor becomes an instrument of survival, a burden carried for wages that barely sustain life. This alienation from the act of labor strips workers of agency and turns their daily activity into a form of domination, reinforcing the power of capital of every hour of their lives. Beyond the workplace, capitalism alienates individuals from their own human nature. Because survival requires selling labor power, every aspect of life becomes subordinated to economic necessity. The pursuit of creativity, community, contemplation, and freedom becomes secondary to the immediate demand of earning a living. Human beings who possess immense intellectual and emotional potential are forced into roles that do not reflect their capabilities or aspirations. The system molds them into instruments of profit, rather than autonomous beings capable of shaping their own destiny. Alienation thus extends into the core of the self, creating an internal disconnection between what one is and what one must be to survive. Yet perhaps the most devastating form of alienation is the separation of workers from one another. Capitalism thrives by transforming social relations into competitive ones. Workers are compelled to see each other not as comrades, but as rivals for jobs, wages, and security. One person's advancement is framed as another's loss. Fragmented by wage differences, workplace hierarchies, precarious contracts, and divisions of race, gender, nationality, and culture, workers become isolated even while standing side by side. The ruling class exploits these divisions with precision, knowing that a united working class would possess immense collective power capable of challenging the foundations of the system. Alienation thus becomes a strategy for control, weakening solidarity, and preventing workers from recognizing their shared interests. Capitalism even manufactures false identities that overshadow class consciousness. People begin to perceive themselves through consumer brands, job titles, lifestyle difference, and social status rather than through their shared relationship to production. These artificial identities conceal the reality that millions experience the same exploitation, the same dependence on wages, the same insecurity, even if the surface appearance of their lives differs. The alienation of workers from each other ensures that the collective strength of the class remains dormant, making exploitation appear natural and resistance appear futile. Through these forms of alienation, separation from the product, the process, the self, and the collective capitalism secures its survival. It fragments the workers' world into isolated parts, preventing awareness of the full structure that governs their life. Yet the moment workers begin to recognize this alienation not as personal failure but as systemic design, the conditions emerge for consciousness, unity, and the possibility of transformation. The working class is the true engine of history and the creator of all wealth, not by symbolic praise or romantic idealization, but by the concrete reality that every structure of society, every commodity in circulation, every system of production, and every technological advance rests upon the labor of ordinary people whose names rarely enter historical record. From the earliest communal societies to the rise of agriculture, from the birth of industry to the complexity of the modern global economy, the force that has driven transformation has always been collective human labor. The ruling classes across epochs have claimed authorship of civilization, but their power has rested entirely on the work performed by others. Monarchs did not build their palaces, capitalists did not construct their factories, financiers did not produce the wealth they trade. At every stage, the hands, minds, and coordinated efforts of workers have shaped the world even as the benefits of their labor have been appropriated by those who own the means of production. When Marx argued that the working class is the engine of history, he was identifying a truth that becomes clearer. The deeper one looks beneath the narratives of rulers who position themselves as the makers of society. History is often told through the deeds of kings, generals, and political leaders, but the real movement, what alters the material conditions of life, comes from the labor that sustains and transforms society. Revolutions have never erupted because elites desired them, but because the productive forces elevated by collective labor eventually clashed with relations of ownership that constrained them. Every major societal shift has a reason when the organization of labor outgrew the system designed to control it. Workers, though often unacknowledged, are the ones who propel societies forward simply by building, cultivating, manufacturing, transporting, maintaining, and innovating in ways that make life possible. In capitalism, this reality becomes even more pronounced. The wealth of the modern world is generated through the exploitation of labor, through the extraction of surplus value from workers who produce more than they receive in wages. Every profit, every dividend, every accumulation of capital originates in the difference between what workers create and what they are compensated. Without this surplus labor, capitalism would collapse instantly. Machines do not create value, they only transfer it. Capitalists do not create value. They merely own the conditions under which labor is performed. It is the worker, whether on the assembly line, in the field, behind, computer, on a construction site, or providing essential services, who infuses raw materials with value, who transforms potential into product, who generates the wealth that capital later claims as its own. Even technological advancement, often credited to innovators or entrepreneurs, is grounded in the accumulated knowledge, collective experimentation, and cooperative labor of generations of workers. The technologies that define modern productivity: automation, digital networks, logistics systems, advanced manufacturing are not the inventions of individuals operating in isolation, but the culmination of shared human effort, built upon the discoveries of scientists, the skills of engineers, the practical insights of technicians, and the day-to-day labor of millions who operate, test, refine, and maintain these systems. Capital appropriates these achievements as if they were personal triumphs of the elite, but in truth, they are social products created through the coordination of working people across time and space. The working class is also the engine of history in political terms because its conditions ultimately determine when the contradictions of a system become intolerable, when exploitation intensifies, when inequality widens, when insecurity deepens. It is the working class that first feels the pressure and the strain. These conditions awaken consciousness, create friction, and generate movements that challenge the existing order. The power of the ruling class rests on the consistent functioning of labor. When workers withdraw their labor, organize collectively, or develop a shared understanding of their exploitation, the entire system trembles. Strikes, mass movements, and uprisings have historically come not from the privileged, but from those who felt the weight of injustice most sharply. Their collective actions have secured every major gain attributed to democracy and social progress, labor rights, universal suffrage, social protections, public education, safer workplaces, shorter workdays, and countless other advances that elites resisted but were forced to concede when workers asserted their power. Despite this, capitalism works tirelessly to obscure the workers' central role. Through ideology, propaganda, consumer culture, and hierarchical structures, the system convinces workers that they are replaceable, powerless, and dependent on the goodwill of employers. Yet the underlying reality remains unchanged. Without workers, society stops. The world runs on their labor, not on the decisions of boardrooms or the calculations of investors. The essential nature of the working class becomes most visible during crises, when their labor is urgently needed while the wealthy retreat into comfort and safety. Every moment of disruption reveals what is always true, that the working class sustains the world through its collective strength. To understand that the working class is the true creator of wealth is to understand that the power to transform society lies not in the hands of the few who own its resources, but in the many who produce its value. This realization turns resignation into awareness, awareness into solidarity, and solidarity into the potential for a new form of social organization. The recognition of the worker's central role in history is not merely a moral argument but a material fact that illuminates both the source of exploitation and the source of transformative power, unity, and collective organization are the ruling class's greatest fear and workers' greatest strength, because they strike at the heart of capitalism's dependence on fragmentation, isolation, and competition. The power of capital rests not merely on ownership of factories, technology, or financial infrastructure, but on the assumption that workers will remain divided, each person struggling alone, each group separated by artificial boundaries, each community preoccupied with its own immediate survival. The system's stability depends on preventing workers from recognizing their shared conditions, shared interests, and shared potential. The ruling class understands that the moment workers see themselves not as isolated individuals, but as members of a collective force, the architecture of domination becomes vulnerable. Power begins to leak from the top and flow back toward those who create all value, maintain all functions, and sustain the world through their labor. Capitalism cultivates division with precision because unity disrupts its core logic. Workers who see each other as competitors cannot form alliances capable of challenging exploitation. Workers who distrust one another cannot organize for better conditions. Workers who are fragmented by race, nationality, gender, religion, or status become easier to manage because their energy is directed horizontally toward each other rather than vertically toward the structures that exploit them. This division is not accidental but engineered. It is reinforced through wages that fluctuate by industry and region, educational pathways that sort people into hierarchies, legal systems that privilege some forms of labor over others, and cultural narratives that glorify individuality while ridiculing solidarity. Yet beneath these layers of division lies a fundamental truth. Workers share a common relationship to capital. Whether one works in an office, a factory, a field, a hospital, or a warehouse, the underlying reality is the same. Survival depends on selling labor power. wages reflect only a fraction of value created, and the conditions of life are shaped by decisions made by those who own the means of production. When workers begin to see this commonality, the possibility of unity emerges. This unity is not sentimental or symbolic, it is material. It arises from the recognition that the challenges facing one worker, low wages, long hours, instability, exploitation, are variations of the same structure affecting millions around the world. What separates them is far less important than what binds them. Collective organization transforms this recognition into power. Individually, workers can be exploited, ignored, or replaced. Collectively, they become indispensable. A single worker refusing exploitation may be dismissed, but thousands refusing simultaneously can halt production, disrupt supply chains, and force concessions. A lone voice demanding justice may be muted, but a chorus of voices, coordinated and determined, becomes impossible to suppress. This is why history's most significant worker victories, from the 8-hour workday to safer workplaces, from collective bargaining rights to social protections, were won through organization, not individual effort. The ruling class resisted each of these gains fiercely, but ultimately yielded because organized workers threatened the stability and profitability of the system itself. The ruling class fears this unity because it exposes their dependence on those they exploit. Their wealth, power, and authority exist only as long as workers remain cooperative and divided. The moment workers act together, capital loses its aura of inevitability. The mystique of the job creator dissolves, revealing that it is the worker who creates all value while the owner merely appropriates it. This revelation destabilizes the ideological foundation of capitalism, which depends on convincing workers that their interests are aligned with those who profit from their labor. Unity exposes the falsehood of this narrative, demonstrating that the interests of workers are fundamentally opposed to those of capital. In that contradiction lies the potential for transformation. Collective organization also builds the structures necessary for sustained struggle. It creates spaces for political education, shared strategy, and mutual support. It cultivates solidarity across different sectors of the working class, enabling coordinated action that transcends individual workplaces. It strengthens the capacity of workers to articulate demands, negotiate conditions, and challenge injustices that would otherwise remain invisible. It becomes a counterpower capable of confronting not only individual employers but the larger system that perpetuates exploitation. The ruling class therefore works tirelessly to undermine collective organization. They promote anti-union sentiment, criminalize protest, incentivize competition, and flood society with narratives that portray solidarity as outdated or dangerous. They fear unity because it signals the awakening of a force capable of altering the balance of power. Workers who understand their collective strength begin to question the legitimacy of those who rule over them. They see that the power of the ruling class is not natural, inevitable, or deserved, but derived entirely from the labor and obedience of millions. When workers unite, they reclaim agency over their lives and become authors of their own history. Unity transforms despair into determination, isolation into community, weakness into strength. It reveals that the ruling class, for all its wealth and influence, is outnumbered and structurally dependent on those it exploits. And through this recognition, workers discover the latent power that has shaped every major advance in human society, a power that remains alive wherever people stand together and transform shared struggle in collective force. Emancipation requires transforming awareness into organized, collective action, because consciousness alone, no matter how clear or profound, cannot dismantle the structures that produce exploitation. The ruling order has always tolerated a certain degree of individual understanding. It even allows criticism so long as it remains confined to private thought or isolated frustration. What it fears, and what history consistently shows to be transformative, is the moment where recognition becomes coordinated effort, when scattered insights fuse into collective will, and when workers cease to see themselves as solitary individuals navigating a hostile system and begin to understand themselves as a class with shared interests and shared power. Awareness is the spark, but organization is the fire that spreads beyond the individual mind into the fabric of society. Every oppressive system depends upon disorganization. Workers may understand that they are underpaid, overworked, or exploited, but without structures that unify their efforts, this understanding remains inert. Capitalism survives precisely because it isolates individuals, persuading each worker that their problems are personal rather than structural. Even when people recognize the collective nature of their suffering, the pressures of daily survival pull them back into solitude. The logic of competition, the fragmentation of workplaces, and the constant insecurity of wages all create barriers that inhibit collective expression. Awareness without organization becomes a burden that weighs heavily on the individual yet changes nothing in the world. Emancipation requires lifting that burden from the solitary mind and placing it in the hands of a united collective capable of acting with intention. The transition from awareness to organized action begins when individuals realize that their struggle, though experienced privately, are shared conditions rooted in the economic structure. When workers understand that low wages, rising costs, burnout, stress, and insecurity are not random misfortunes but systematic outcomes, they begin to see the necessity of cooperation. This recognition exposes a fundamental truth. No single worker, no matter how determined, can overcome the structural power of capital alone. The employer who sets wages, the corporation that dictates policies, the government that upholds laws protecting private ownership, these entities respond not to individual complaints, but to collective pressure. Organization is the channel through which awareness acquires force. Throughout history, transformative movements emerged only when people built institutions of their own. Union, councils, assemblies, committees, and associations that gave structure to their shared interests. These forms of organization are not merely tactical tools, they are expressions of class consciousness made tangible. They convert scattered insights into coordinated strategies, enabling workers to act not as isolated laborers but as a unified force whose strength multiplies with each new participant. When workers organize, they discover leverage they never knew they possessed. The ability to withdraw labor, negotiate collectively, resist exploitation, challenge unjust conditions, and influence political decisions. Organization amplifies each individual voice by weaving it into a chorus that cannot be ignored. Yet collective action does not arise automatically from awareness. Capitalism actively undermines the development of worker organizations using legal barriers, ideological manipulation, workplace surveillance, and divide-and-rule tactics to prevent unity. It encourages workers to distrust one another, to compete for promotions, to internalize individualism as a survival strategy, and to see collective efforts as risky or futile. This is why transforming awareness into organization requires courage and persistent effort. The ruling class invests immense resources in maintaining disunity because it understands that organized workers hold the potential to disrupt profit, challenge ownership, and reshape the entire structure of society. The difficulty of organizing is precisely what makes it powerful when achieved. Collective action is not limited to formal structures. It includes everyday practices, sharing information, supporting co-workers, building solidarity across divisions of race, gender, nationality, and occupation, and cultivating environments where workers trust one another enough to speak openly about their condition. It includes the gradual formation of a collective identity that replaces isolation with mutual recognition. When workers begin to say we instead of I, when they understand that their dignity is tied to the dignity of others, when solidarity becomes a habit rather than a slogan, the foundations of emancipation begin to materialize. True freedom does not emerge from individual escape to personal success, nor from attempting to outmaneuver a system designed to exploit. Emancipation becomes possible when workers recognize that their liberation is interconnected, that the chains binding one are linked to the chains binding all. The shift from awareness to organization transforms passive understanding into active force. It turns critique into strategy, frustration into confidence, and vulnerability into collective strength. It prepares workers not merely to interpret the world, but to intervene in it. When awareness becomes organized action, the working class discovers its latent power, the ability to disrupt exploitation, to reclaim control over the conditions of labor, and to shape the future according to human needs rather than profit. Emancipation is not granted from above, it is built from below through the conscious, deliberate, and united activity of the many who create the wealth of society. The truth that has unfolded before you is not a series of isolated grievances, but a single, continuous thread woven through the lives of workers across generations. Your suffering, your labor, your alienation, your power, all of it belongs to a historical struggle far larger than any individual life. The system thrives by hiding this truth, by fragmenting your experience, by convincing you that change is impossible and that your voice is insignificant. Yet the moment you recognize your place within the long arc of class struggle, the narrative shifts. What once felt like a private burden becomes a shared condition, and what once felt immovable becomes open to transformation. Unity, organization, and collective consciousness are not abstract ideals, but the practical forces through which history has always been rewritten. The ruling class fears them because they expose the fragility of their power. Workers rely on them because they reveal the strength of theirs. And so the conclusion is not an ending but a beginning, an invitation to see yourself as part of a class whose awakening signals the possibility of a new world. When awareness becomes action, and action becomes solidarity, the foundations of the old order begin to tremble.